Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Lois, for the invitation to talk. And, it's funny, I live in Chester County. And in fact, my family has lived in Chester County for over 300 years. So, but yet I haven't sort of discovered the Westchester Birding Club before. I affiliate with the Delaware Ornithological Society, mostly because that's where I work and do, my research and that sort of thing. But hopefully you all are going to be familiar with some of the places that I'm going to mention here in Chester County, because we are doing some projects in Southeast PA. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, whoops. So y'all can see my screen?
Yep, it looks good.
All right, so yeah, I've been at the University of Delaware for about a decade now. And like I said, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, although I grew up in Maryland, but luckily found my way back here for my position at University of Delaware. So, and I use weather radar is the main tool that I use to look at bird movements and bird migration. And I'm one of a handful of scientists here in the US that actively uses the radar to study bird migration. And you might be familiar with some of the work from some of my colleagues, the Birdcast website that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has developed. And one of my former students is actually one of the lead investigators on that project. But I am going to talk about bird migration on radar a little bit, but I'm actually going to talk more about some of the other projects that we have ongoing that are looking at waterfowl distributions during the day and the night using weather radar, and also some radio telemetry work that we're doing on purple martins here in Southeast PA and in Delaware. So here in the US, we're lucky that we have this nice extensive network of weather radars, or that are formerly called WSR-88D. And the WSR, well, it stands for weather surveillance radar, but I like to think of it as wildlife surveillance radar, because in fact, the radars detect more biology than they detect meteorology. But a lot of that biology is filtered out by the meteorologists, right? So sort of like their garbage is our treasure for the wildlife biologists. And we have about 150 radars in the network, and they've been operating since the mid-1990s and sort of digitally recording all the data that they collect. And all these radars are scanning the air every 5 to 10 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the last 25 plus years. And it's one of the largest biological data sets in existence. It's about 3 petabytes. So petabytes like 1,000 terabytes. And if you're familiar with bird migration on radar, this is sort of what it looks like in sped up quite a bit. So this is about, I forget how many days this is, but this is a fall migration season. So all these little pulses, hopefully it's coming through in Zoom okay, but you see all these little blue pulses around all the radars, and those are the nightly migrations of birds. So they're just turning on and off for day and night kind of. You can also see lots of weather, precipitation kind of moving across the country, but this is the raw radar data that you don't normally see, like on the Weather Channel, right? Like I said, they filter out all the biology and just show you the precipitation, but there's a lot of activity going on here. And I want to touch on one aspect of my research that that we've been working on recently, and that's looking at light pollution impacts on migratory birds. And I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but there is this World Migratory Bird Day that gets celebrated every year, actually twice a year. So I think May 9th is the spring Migratory Bird Day, and then the other days in October. But they usually have a theme for the Migratory Bird Day, and this year it's light pollution. So the slogan for this year is "Dim the lights for bird at night." And so it's sort of fitting that some of the research that I'm doing has contributed to this knowledge that we have about how light pollution impacts migratory birds. And it's getting a lot more sort of attention in recent years because we've been really sort of ramping up a lot of the work on what we know about light pollution in migratory birds. And radar is an important tool to help us do that, right? So, and this is, so looking at that national picture, if we sort of zoom in here, our local radar in Dover, Delaware, that's the dot in red here. This is just sort of a loop of one night showing you the emergence of nocturnal bird migration. So most birds migrate at night, and they take off in these well-synchronized flights shortly after sunset around the end of civil twilight. And this is what it looks like at the Dover, Delaware radar. It can only detect birds out to about Philadelphia before the radar beam gets too high. And so it's not that there aren't birds in the sky there, they're just too low, they're below the radar beam. So so it does see birds at higher, once they get up in the air, we can see them in Westchester, that's the blue dot. But this is showing you one night that I've sort of cherry picked, mostly because it really displays well how closely these birds are associated to bright areas. And so what the white and the black is showing you is essentially the how intense the artificial light at night is across the region. So you can see I pointed out some of these cities nearby, like Philadelphia and Wilmington and Baltimore, right? And so in the imagery, the areas where you see yellow are the highest densities of birds. And on this particular night, you can see all along the I-95 corridor between Baltimore and Philadelphia, some real intense densities of birds as they're lifting off from the places where they're stopping over during the day. And even, you know, smaller urban areas like Dover is lighting up. There's a signal there. There's a signal over here in like Annapolis, Maryland. And of course, the peninsula of Cape May Peninsula in New Jersey lights up, mostly because birds get funneled down into that peninsula. And so there's just high densities of birds there for other reasons, right? Not necessarily because there's a bright light. But we've more formally studied this and discovered that light pollution is drawing birds into cities from the sky glow that the cities are emitting, and this relationship extends very far from the cities. So this is, I think this is what Flagstaff, Arizona looks like at night from about 40 kilometers away. You know, it's a typical scene if you've ever seen the sky glow on the horizon. And what you see down below here is what we did was we looked at a bunch of radar data from 16 radars in the northeastern US, and we can look at where these birds are taking off from very close to the onset of their migration. And we can essentially map where they were on the ground and in what densities they are on the ground. And we can then sort of model the relationship of these bird densities and their distributions in relation to various factors. So some of the more important relationships that we see is this first one here on the left is showing you how bird density increases when there's more hardwood forest in the landscape. So most of these birds, this is looking at autumn migration, they're coming down from the boreal forests of Canada. We have lots of forest birds. Forest can hold higher densities of birds. So where we see forest, we see more birds. And another important relationship that we find is that here in the mid-Atlantic and also along the Gulf of Mexico coast and around the Great Lakes is that birds tend to congregate near the coastline. So this is showing you as you get closer and closer to the coast, their densities really start to increase as you get within, say, 20 kilometers of the coast. And then this last relationship was really sort of the major discovery of this paper was that we looked at this relationship between birds and how far they were to bright areas. And so we defined bright areas where the sky glow is 5 times the natural brightness, essentially bright enough to when you can't see the Milky Way anymore. That's what we designated as bright areas. And what we found is that bird density increases as you get closer to these bright areas, essentially all the major cities like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and New York. And it extends out. Well, we could only go out to about 225 kilometers or so, because that's about as far as you can get and be as far away as you can get from a bright area in the northeastern US. But for these birds that are flying at night, they're flying at maybe 500 meters above the ground. They can see 100 kilometers or more to the horizon. So there's very few places in the northeastern US where these birds that are migrating at night can't see a city on the horizon. And so this is sort of another way of looking at this relationship here. There's a radar near Baltimore, Maryland, and this is just showing you sort of the different land cover on the left. So all the black is urban development, the green are forests. And what we find essentially is around all these major cities is that what's painted here in red on the right is where we see the highest densities of birds. So within this whole field of view and sort of the larger radar domain, that highest 15% of bird density is these birds are packing into these urban and suburban forests around the major cities. And they're using them in much higher densities than they would, say, an area much further from the city. So you take the same patch of forest in, say, Philadelphia, Fairmount Park actually lights up with very high densities. It actually has higher densities of birds than Cape May, New Jersey. But if you were to look at, say, someplace, in central PA, the density of birds is much lower. And so one of the concerns we have is that there might be potential negative consequences for these migrants that are drawn into these urban areas, right? So we know that there is greater risk of mortality from different sources of anthropogenic, causes of mortality. So things like colliding with glass, right? We lose upwards of 1 billion birds every year that collide with glass, not only high rises, but, residential houses and things, right? Anywhere where there's glass on buildings. And we've probably all experienced birds colliding into windows at our home and we lose a lot of birds that way. And we know that there's been some other research to show that the more artificial light there is, the more attraction to these, they draw in more birds. And so there is a relationship between sort of the brightness of a building and how many birds collide with it at a very small scale. And we also know that domestic cats are a major source of mortality for birds. Even more birds die, like 1 to 4 billion birds are estimated to die annually just within the United States from cats. So these are 2 major sources of mortality for birds. And something else that you might not necessarily think about is if we are drawing these birds into these suburban and urban areas, that, you know, the plants that we have planted in these urban areas and are in our backyards, a lot of them are non-native plants, right? And my colleague Doug Tallamy, who's you may be familiar with some of the books that he's written that really demonstrate the importance of native plants in supporting insect populations, and in this case, as food for birds, right? So, and he argues that, you know, our backyards can be places that sustain wildlife, and we can improve sort of the quality of these areas by focusing on planting native plants, right, to increase insect populations and support birds. So, and there's also, if you are familiar with the Birdcast website, that's sort of depicted down here in the bottom right, that's the forecast for tonight. So what we've also been able to do with the radar data is look through, you know, the last 25 years and be able to look at the weather conditions, the time of year, the location of places, and predict quite accurately, you know, how much migration is going to happen on a nightly basis. And they do forecasts out to like 3 nights out, like we do a weather forecast. So this is the forecast for tonight. And then if you go to their website, you can actually see what the real-time radar data look like. But one feature that they have is this lights out alerts, so which is depicted here on the left. So based on those predictions, they, for certain cities, they will create these forecasts, basically, you know, like high, medium, and low warnings to let people know that, you know, if you're in an area where they're in a high lights out alert, to sort of dim your lights at night, right, to help reduce the impact on those migratory birds. I do see something coming up in the chat. Yeah, so Birdcast, it's a great place, great website. And you can also learn more about how we use radar to study bird migration there. And, you know, there are lots of lights out programs. We have one in Delaware, in Newark, Lights Out Newark, Delaware, where we're trying to get businesses and homeowners to turn their lights off at night during migration. Yeah, and there's lots of programs nationwide. Most major cities have one. So,
Jeff, it's
yeah.
Donna. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you just go back to the map?
Yeah.
In the west and the south, what are the white line circles? Is that just
So that's,
boundaries of precipitation?
yeah, so that's showing you where there's rain happening tonight, which usually, you know, birds don't like to migrate through the rain. So usually those are going to be areas where there's very little migration. But yeah, it looks like tonight there's some rain and storms predicted for Texas, but it looks like there's still going to be birds, you know, maybe moving through that area. But you can see, like, through in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina seems to be where there's going to be the heaviest migration tonight. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. So then another project that we're working on, which is sort of timely, is that we've been using weather radar to look at waterfowl distributions, and we're working on modeling waterfowl distributions with radar so that we can predict where waterfowl are during the winter months, mostly because that's when we're better able to see the waterfowl distributions during the winter. But it's also an important time of year because, you know, these birds are they're overwintering here in the US, and where they coincide with the poultry industry, there is risk of those birds transmitting avian influenza to to commercial poultry. So we have this project, we're working with folks out in California at University of California, Davis and USGS, both out in California and here locally in the Mid-Atlantic, but collaborating with some poultry vets here at at UD and also in California on this project. And of course, we're in the middle of a high path avian influenza outbreak. And so what typically happens is there is this low pathogenic influenza virus that's very common among lots of different bird species. It's basically like their common cold, right? And they do sort of spill over from wild birds into poultry all the time. But when it becomes dangerous is when that low path AI will mutate into a highly pathogenic form that can cause, massive bird die-offs. And this has happened about 28 times in the past, and we're now in like the 29th time here in the US. So in that map is showing you as I just downloaded it today, that's sort of the current number of flocks, commercial poultry flocks in different states that have been infected with avian influenza. So it looks like there aren't any yet in Pennsylvania, although there are birds that have been detected in Pennsylvania, like you mentioned, someone mentioned the bald eagle. Which is interesting because in this outbreak this year, we're seeing a lot more like raptor species that are showing up sick. So things like red-shouldered hawks and vultures and eagles, right, that are probably preying on sick birds and getting infected that way, because most of the birds that tend to be the reservoir for the high path avian influenza are waterfowl, so right, ducks and geese and swans, and also the Charadriformes, the gulls and shorebirds and terns. So this winter, we have a strain, it's labeled H5N1. That's the particular strain that is associated with this outbreak that comes from Europe. And there have been at least 376 detections in wild birds across 26 states. And we have 35 commercial poultry facilities across 15 states that have lost almost 8 million chickens and turkeys. So this is a much bigger outbreak. The last major outbreak was in 2014. And of course, like I said, waterfowl will congregate in these large flocks during winter. And here in the Mid-Atlantic, we have we hold large populations of snow geese, among other species. And of course, where they're mixing with these high densities of poultry is sort of a recipe for disaster, for risk from avian influenza. So here are the sort of 4 major migratory flyways for waterfowl. I've just sort of crudely highlighted the major wintering areas in the darker colors. So here along the Atlantic, we have this purple region. And there's also showing you where that we have weather radars. But what I want to show you here is what waterfowl look like when they are taking off. So this is actually a video of what this looks like on the ground. These are ducks that are coming out of this place where the arrow is pointed to. Again, at around, shortly after sunset, it's mostly dabbling ducks that will take off at night, and some geese. So they've been roosting during the day, and then they fly out to, in California, it's flooded rice fields that they fly out to in the evenings to feed during the night. And so they're flying out of the pink or purple or the wetlands, and they're flying out to these blue areas, which are the flooded rice fields. So again, this is just a little loop kind of showing you what that looks like.
Hey, Jeff, it's done. I have another question.
Sure.
How do these migrating birds actually infect the poultry, especially if the poultry are in those locations like you just showed?
Yeah, so, well, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but I'll show you here in a minute. We definitely see waterfowl that will be in close proximity to these poultry farms, right? And they're shedding virus everywhere, as geese do, right? They make a mess. And so it might be that, you know, people walk through the excrement and carry it into the poultry houses, right?
Oh,
Or it could be some other animal like mice or house sparrows or something, right? Might move it from the waterfowl into the poultry houses. So yeah, there's lots of different ways it might actually find its way into the poultry house. It's not that the geese come walking into the poultry house or something like that, but it's just that they're probably shedding virus very close to the houses, and then it's getting brought in to the farms, probably from people walking in.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, so they do have a bunch of biosecurity, protocols that they use to try and minimize that. Like, they have to wash their shoes and things before they go into the poultry houses to help try to reduce the spread. But yeah, and so that was showing you kind of what the waterfowl movement looks like sort of in the evening as they go out for these evening feeding flights. And that's kind of depicted here by these big spikes in activity very close to the beginning of the night. So this is kind of showing you throughout a whole day, 24-hour day cycle, sort of what the activity of birds, of ducks and geese are in the air, right? And this is based on some telemetry data, but we also see this in the radar imagery. So birds are active throughout the day, right? And for geese, they're much more active during the day. And so we wanted to be able to quantify that activity throughout the day. And so what we've been doing with this recent project is looking at this radar imagery throughout the day, not just getting sort of like a single snapshot as these birds are leaving their daytime roost areas to see where they are on the ground, but actually integrating data throughout the whole day to look at where they are in the air, where they're potentially, shedding virus. So we're calling it the shedscape, right? So we can kind of quantify sort of the bird activity in the air, which should be related to how much virus they're shedding on the ground. And so what we do is we take, say, that image of that one night. It's sort of like taking a long photo exposure, right? Because we have each of those images in that video is like every 5 to 10 minutes we get the radar sample the airspace. So we just sort of mash all those scans together in into one day, and then we can look across multiple days. And so this image here on the right is showing you where we've sort of averaged over, up to 10,000 scans, the amount of bird activity in the air. Sort of like a long exposure photograph. And can basically start to see sort of some of these flight paths that birds are typically using. So here's some of this telemetry data that we've overlaid next to it in green. These are actual paths of birds that have radio tags on them. And you can see where they're kind of matching up to these high density areas that are showing up on the radar. So, and this is what that activity looks like here on the Delmarva. So if you're familiar with some waterfowl hotspots in Delaware, so this is Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge that lights up. Here's Bombay Hook up here in more northern Delaware. But we have lots of other activity. There's actually activity of gulls flying around too. So some of these hotspots are actually landfills where there's lots of gull activity, which are also species that are potentially moving avian influenza around. And so we're interested in trying to identify like those poultry farms that might have greater exposure to waterfowl activity. So the areas in red are where we see the highest bird activity throughout the day. And this is like for the month of December of 2020. And all the black specks here are poultry farms on the ground. So we can identify, farms that have potentially high exposure to water, to, you know, wild birds, and others that have lower exposure. And using that information, we're actually building a web application that farmers will be able to use that will like alert them when there are waterfowl near their farm. But another part of that project is we're putting GPS tags on waterfowl. So here, this is Matt Hardy. He's a master student in my lab, and he was tagging Canada geese and mallards. He's holding a mallard there, and we also have been putting tags on snow geese. We have collaborators in Canada that are putting tags on geese and snow geese in Canada. But here he was trapping these geese at Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge, and in the middle kind of shows you a path of one of these birds over some time here. But we have about 100 birds that we've tagged. Most of those are snow geese. And over here, you can see all these purple. Those are all the sort of detections that we're getting from these GPS units. So we put these, they're either a neck collar here that you can see on this Canada goose, and they're solar powered, or they have a battery, but they get charged by the solar panel, and they take basically a location every 5 minutes. They take a GPS fix of where the bird is, and then we also get data on the activity of the bird if it's moving around at the time that the GPS is taking that fix. And for the mallards, they have like a little backpack that we put on them. And so most of these are tracks from snow geese that go up into the high Arctic in Canada to breed. But you can see they all come back down here to the mid-Atlantic to overwinter. Some of them go down to North Carolina, but most of them are sticking around the Delmarva Peninsula in southern PA during the winter. And actually, this is a little animation show you. This is Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge, if you've ever been there. And these are two geese that we have tagged, and just showing you the tracks over a couple days, their movements. And so they tend to hang out in the marsh in these impoundments during the day or during the night, and then they will fly out. There's an ag field out here that they like to, you know, right there. They go to visit and feed. Sometimes during the day, like early in the morning, they'll fly out to those fields. So that's just to kind of give you an idea of there they were out in the field, where kind of the activity of these geese looks like. But of course, we're tracking them all year round, which is why we see them going up to the high Arctic to breed. But we're mostly focused on their winter activity. And here's showing you some of the tracks of two different individual birds in yellow, and in close proximity to these poultry farms. So the poultry farms are depicted here in the red rectangles. And so, you know, these birds are hanging out right next to these, you know, in the fields, next to these houses, or in there, you know, they may have, this one's actually, you can't tell, but there's a pond here right next to the farm where this goose has been hanging out. And in fact, the first egg farm that got infected here in Delaware, we actually had a track of one of our birds that was hanging out near there back in December. But then in February is when they sort of had the flock get infected. So right now the USDA is really interested in the data that we have. We're trying to do some sort of forensic investigation of some of these farms that have been infected here in Delaware and Maryland.
Jeff, I had a question. It's Lois. Do you get real time? Like, can you check on the bird and its location anytime?
Yeah, in fact, I have an app on my phone called the Animal Tracker, and if I turn it on, I can see where our birds are. Like
That is so cool.
It is cool. It is pretty cool.
And it's using a GPS because.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so the tag that's on the birds is like a GPS unit that's like in your phone, right? And it communicates with the cell network. So they're basically like little phones that we're putting on the birds because they communicate to the cell network, which is why we get that real-time information. So as long as they're within range of a cell tower, right, and can connect, we can get that data in basically in real time. So when they went up to the high Arctic, they're out of cell coverage range. So until they come back down south, and then it downloads all the data. So we got 4 months of data all at once when they came back down to southern Canada.
They can only use this on bigger birds because, so that's really cool.
Yeah, I think the smallest of these types of tags that they make are about 9 grams, which typically you can only it can only be about 3% of the bird's body weight can be these tags. So yeah, we can't tag small birds with these tags. There are some very small GPS tags that you can put on small passerine birds, but they only get a few locations, right? You might get like 30 locations in total. Whereas these birds were getting, a location every 5 minutes kind of thing. So
Jeff, this is Barry Blust. I have a question about the trackers themselves. Is that cellular technology trackers, or like they use on the Snowy Owl Project Snowstorm, or?
Yeah, they're very similar tags. So the company we're using is called Ornatella. They're actually out of Lithuania that produces these. But yeah, they're called GSM. They're called like GPS/GSM. I forget what the GSM stands for, but basically those are the tags that work on a cell phone network to communicate. And they can actually sort of locate themselves with just that GSM signal, like your phone. You don't, if you're not connected to satellites, it can still sort of triangulate your location among the cell towers and that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And then the last project, I just have a few slides here to talk about another tracking project where we're using different tracking technology to track purple martin movements here in the Mid-Atlantic. And this is work that's sponsored by Delaware Audubon, and we're working with folks from the Delaware Nature Society in Stewart. And Jim Moore, I heard folks mention the Great Marsh. You're going to go do a field trip there, I think. So Jim Moore, who's at the Great Marsh Institute, he's collaborating with us on this project as well. And we're using, for this project, we're using what's called the Modus Wildlife Tracking System. So this is more like conventional radio telemetry, where you put a little radio frequency tag on these birds that just sort of pings at a certain frequency. And as long as you're listening on that frequency with a conventional sort of radio receiver, you can detect these birds. And so all these yellow dots that you see are where these sort of automated receiver stations have been deployed, and it's global. It started in 2013 in Canada. So Canada is really sort of the group behind this Modus effort. But you can see in the northeastern US, we've got lots of receiver stations. In fact, there's about 1,300 receiver stations in the whole network globally, mostly in southern Ontario is where it originated, so they're really covered well there. But here across Pennsylvania, we actually, and this was in part through the Project Snowstorm, helped sort of get funding to put up these towers. So, or was it Project Snowstorm? I can't remember. It was another project where they were tagging saw-whet owls. Maybe that's not Project Snowstorm. I think that's snowy owls.
Project Owlnet.
Yeah, Owlnet. Okay. So yeah, I think Scott Wiensall is affiliated with this is Willistown Conservation Trust.
Yes.
That spearheaded this sort of Northeast Modus project where they put basically a fence of towers across Pennsylvania. And they put some other towers in other places as well. And we got some funding to put up towers here in northern Delaware and southeast PA. So we have like a tower. So these are some of the towers that we've put up. This is at Bucktoe Preserve near Avondale, PA. This is the Delaware Museum of Natural Science. This is the one that we have at Longwood Gardens. So we have a tower there. This is the one near my house in London Grove, PA. And then we have a tower here at the University of Delaware campus. So those are some of these yellow dots on here. So other ones that are around Westchester, there's the Westtown School has a receiver station, and also at Rushton Farm, they have a station, and one at Great Marsh Institute. And this is one of the colonies that where we're tagging purple martins. This is the one at Bucktoe Preserve. But we've been tagging birds since 2020 and 2021, and we're tagging more birds this summer. And we're putting these tags. This is one of our purple martins that has this tag, and it's called a life tag. Weighs about 0.5 gram, and it's put on like a backpack. And there's a little solar panel down here. So this one is only solar powered. So it only works during the day. And it sends out a signal every 2 seconds. And we've tagged about 95 birds, sort of split between adults and juveniles at various locations like Ashland Nature Center, the colony there, the colony at Bucktoe. We have actually tagged a few birds at the Longwood Garden colony. We're going to tag some more there this year. And we've got millions of detections. So like I said, these tags ping every 2 seconds, and those towers have these directional Yagi antennas on them that are pointed out in different directions. So we can listen and know what direction from the tower these birds are pinging. These are some, this is Ian. He's our master bander. He's the one that's putting all the tags on the birds. And this is Katie Bird. That is her last name. She's my master's student who's working on the project. And these are some of our birds that we've tagged at our colony, so you can see what they look like when they have the tags on them. They have this long antenna that sticks out. And so this is data from around the Bucktoe Tower. So our colony here is at the Blue X. That's also right next to the receiver station that's there. And all these red dots are sort of the locations that we're estimating these birds are as they're flying around the tower. So we can do some math, do some geometry and triangulate these locations. And this is sort of at a very small scale. So we're interested in looking at their habitat use. So we have colonies that are more urban, located in more urban areas like in Newark, Delaware. And then we have this more rural colony in Bucktoe. And we're trying to just get a better understanding of how much they're moving around, what habitats they're using, and trying to relate that to the productivity of the colonies. And we also get very large scale movement. So when we look to that broader network, this is one of the birds we called Nugget that was born at Curtis Mill last summer. And these white lines are sort of showing you it's more large scale movements. So all these little white dots are these other towers that are in the general area. And so what happens is after these birds hatch and leave their colony, they start to move into these large pre-migration roosts. So there's a few roosts in the mid-Atlantic here. And there's one here in Maurice, on the Maurice River in New Jersey is a major one. And like this bird was actually using that roost. And cool thing that we're learning is that these birds will commute like 100 kilometers every day when they're using these large communal roosts. So they'll fly out from the Maurice River, and this bird would like fly back up to, Newark, Delaware every day to sort of forage around. but then it would go down to Maurice River to roost. And there's another large roost at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. One in Salem River in New Jersey. There's one in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So we've had birds go to these various roosts, and we've had some individuals that will use more than one of these large roosts. I didn't show here for sake of time, but we can also see those roosts on radar. So we are doing some radar work with this too. But what is really interesting is, so this last little line here of this bird nugget, this, we actually captured its sort of final, when it finally left for migration, it flew down the Delmarva Peninsula. And then about a month later, we picked it up in Colombia. So, so the martins overwinter in Brazil, in South America, like in the Amazon. And there are some towers in Central America that we picked up some of our birds. So this bird we picked up in Colombia. And then we had another bird, sassafras, that was also born at the same colony last year. And that bird got picked up in Costa Rica. So, and I forget how long, it took it about a month between when it left the Delmarva and showed up in Costa Rica. And what was cool was this Costa Rica receiver station went up, and 2 days later, the bird showed up, and it stayed there for about 9 days before it kept going south to its wintering grounds. And this isn't the bird that was tagged, but just another picture of one of our birds. So, so we also had 2 other birds that were picked up in Panama City. There's a receiver station around the sewage lagoon outside the city, and it picked up 2 of our birds too that were on their way to heading down to Brazil. And we're hoping, we haven't yet detected any of these birds coming back north, but because these tags are solar powered, and they're called life tags, because in theory they should last the life of the bird or until they fall off the bird. But in theory, you know, if these birds are still alive and they're still coming back and the tags are still working, hopefully we can detect them when they return this spring. But we haven't yet had any detections because there isn't a lot of coverage in the southern US of these stations yet. But that's all I have for tonight. So I'm happy to take any questions.